Chapters 7 and 8 of Anybody But Anne, by Carolyn Wells. This recording is in the public domain. 7. The Mysterious Motor Car. "No," cried Mrs. Carstairs impetuously. "David Van Wyck would not do that." "You seem very certain," said Morland, looking at her coldly. "I am certain," she retorted with a flush of her dark eyes. "Do you suppose I've lived under David Van Wyck's roof all these years without learning his nature fairly well? He was a hard man, and severe, but he was just, and above such meanness as you ascribe to him." "But," said I, "you have already expressed an opinion that Mr. Van Wyck died by his own hand. Now, if the pearls were stolen by a burglar, it is a strange coincidence that the two crimes should occur the same night." Mrs. Carstairs looked at me with her face full of baffled rage. Her theories were indeed at variance. If an intruder took the pearls, undoubtedly David Van Wyck had been murdered. If, on the other hand, he had committed suicide, he would seem to be himself responsible for the disappearance of the jewels. For a moment Mrs. Carstairs sat motionless, though it was evident her mind was working rapidly. The rest of us sat watching her, and I, at any rate, began to feel a dawning hope that what she might say next would throw a little light on the mystery. At last she burst out in a voice low but tense with feeling. "I am sure David Van Wyck killed himself. I am sure that if before his death he secreted that valuable pearl necklace, he was entirely justified in doing so." "Just what do you mean by that?" demanded Archer angrily. "I think you all know without being told," returned Mrs. Carstairs, and her lips curled unpleasantly. "Nevertheless, you shall tell," and Archer's voice fairly quivered with indignation. "Speak out before us all, and say what you mean by your insinuation." Mrs. Carstairs looked at him with an air half supercilious and half amused. "Who are you, Mr. Archer," she said, "that you should arraign me in this manner?" "And who are you," thundered Archer, "that you should presume to cast aspersions at any of the Van Wyck family?" Mr. Mellon broke in upon this controversy. "What position do you hold in this house, Mrs. Carstairs?" he inquired, in a tone of such authority that it compelled a respectful answer. "I have been Mr. Van Wyck's housekeeper for 7 years." "You were here, then, before he was married to the present Mrs. Van Wyck?" 5 years before." The very tones of the housekeeper's voice, the reminiscent look in her beautiful, mysterious eyes, and the almost insolent toss of her well poised head, fully confirmed my previous thought that she had deeply resented the advent of Anne. Coroner Mellon looked at her a moment, and then said, as if dismissing her, "You will, of course, be called upon to give your testimony at the inquest." His curt nod of dismissal was sufficient to send Mrs. Carstairs from the room, but she paid no heed to it, and remained sitting in her chair without a trace of embarrassment or self-consciousness. I couldn't help admiring her aplomb, her wonderful self-poise, nor could I help wondering whether she knew anything about the tragedy, or whether her sensational nature made her wish to appear mysterious. I began to like the coroner. He was not prepossessing in appearance, being extremely young for his position, and of a sandy-haired, freckled-faced type that made him look like a blushing schoolboy. But his blue eyes showed a quick intelligence, and I jumped to the conclusion that he was bright and intuitive but inexperienced. "I must ask a few preliminary questions," he said, and there was a little nervous hesitation in his manner, "and I will hold my inquest this afternoon. Dr. Mason, can you tell me at what time the death of Mr. Van Wyck probably occurred?" "He has been dead fully 9 or 10 hours," replied the doctor. "It is probable that he was killed about or after midnight. I refuse to accept the theory of suicide." "Was death instantaneous?" went on Mr. Mellon. "It was, though I shall make further examination. I am already convinced that Mr. Van Wyck was stabbed with a sharp weapon by someone with murderous intent." "But nobody could get in!" exclaimed Mrs. Carstairs, and she sat forward, grasping the arms of her chair and gazing intently at the doctor, as if she would hypnotize him. Although I had begun to dislike the woman, I was forced to admit to myself her marvelous charm. Every pose she assumed seemed more graceful, more picturesque than the one before. and yet I couldn't help thinking that her effects were all carefully premeditated. She showed no self-consciousness, but her self-reliance and self-sufficiency were so marked that I believed her a consummate actress." "We are not considering that now," said Mr. Mellon, looking at her keenly, and then turning to Morland, he said, "Who discovered your father's body?" Morland told briefly the circumstances of breaking in the door, and the coroner listened attentively and thoughtfully. "Summon the valet," he said abruptly. Mrs. Carstairs rose with a sudden start, and exclaimed, "Why do you want him? He is in no way implicated in this matter. He did not attend his master last evening." "Good heavens, madam!" said the coroner, amazed at this outbreak. "Nobody has accused him. Pray calm yourself. Why do you object to his presence here?" "He is my son," said Mrs. Carstairs. "And if he is, that is no reason he should not be questioned." Mr. Mellon gave a grim smile, and shook his head slightly, as if to imply that Mrs. Carstairs was a woman beyond his ken. Morland had touched a bell, in response to which the valet appeared. He had little to tell save to corroborate Morland's story of the morning; but had he himself been guilty of crime he could not have acted more frightened. I remembered, however, that he had shown the same behaviour when the alarm was first raised, and I concluded that it was merely a natural horror of death, and perhaps he had inherited his mother's emotional disposition. But whatever Mrs. Carstairs' attitude toward David Van Wyck or his family, I now perceived that the woman's all-absorbing passion was her son. She watched him with intensity. Her mobile face unconsciously followed the expressions of his countenance. She prompted his speech when he hesitated, and she interrupted and spoke for him so frequently that Mr. Mellon was obliged to reprimand her. But between the trembling valet and his anxious and apprehensive mother, nothing was learned that seemed to be of the least importance. It seemed that as Mr. Van Wyck expected to be up late with the committee men, he had excused Carstairs from attending him when he retired, and the valet had had the evening to himself. When he went to his master's bedroom that morning, he found it had been unoccupied through the night, and he had raised an alarm. The rest of his story was exactly the same as Morland's. I could not see why his mother should be so wrought up over the matter of his appearance, but I set it down to an excessive maternal solicitude lest he should be suspected of implication in the tragedy. "This committee," went on Mr. Mellon, his brows bent in perplexity, "who were they?" "3 gentlemen from the village," said Morland. "They met with my father last night to discuss a business matter. They all went away before I left this room." Suddenly Lassiter made an announcement. He had been looking over the papers that lay on the desk, and he said abruptly, "The deed of gift is gone." "What do you mean?" asked Coroner Mellon, alert for further information. "Last night," said Lassiter, "I was here during the conference of the gentlemen from the village and Mr. Van Wyck. He made out to them a deed of gift of a large sum of money. However, he retained this paper after his visitors had left. He may have put it away after I left myself, but so far I cannot find it." "At what time did you leave?" asked the coroner. "Almost exactly at midnight," returned the secretary. "And where was the deed you speak of then?" "Lying on this desk in front of Mr. Van Wyck." "Who was here when you left, besides Mr. Van Wyck?" "Only his son Morland." "That's a lie!" exclaimed Morland, springing up. "When I left this room at midnight you were here alone with my father." To my surprise, the coroner did not question these contradictory statements. He looked at the 2 men without speaking, though his sharp blue eyes showed that he had understood what they said. "The case is most mysterious," he declared, "and I think it wiser to have no further discussion or investigation until I can hold the inquest and hear definite testimony. The facts of the absolutely inaccessible room and the entire absence of the fatal weapon are so irreconcilable that I confess I am baffled. I think the only course to pursue is to engage the services of a clever and experienced detective." "There is no occasion for such a thing," said Mrs. Carstairs, quite as if she were an authority. "I object to it very decidedly." The coroner looked at her appraisingly, and then turned to Morland Van Wyck. Though he said no word, it was quite evident he was inquiring from whom he should take orders. My liking for Mr. Mellon deepened. He showed brains and common sense, 2 qualities not always found together, and not universally the attributes of coroners. "Your opinion is not wanted, Mrs. Carstairs," Morland said pettishly, but I noticed he did not look at her. "I too think we should have a detective. What do you say, Barbara?" Miss Van Wyck hesitated. "I hate the publicity of it," she said, "but I think we ought to find the pearls." I looked at her in surprise. Were her thoughts all for the jewels, and had she no desire to find and bring to justice the murderer of her father? Then I remembered that her theory was that David Van Wyck had secreted the pearls and then killed himself. "Not only the pearls," Morland was saying. "We must lay bare the whole mystery. I cannot live not knowing how my father met his death. If some villain killed him, the murderer must be brought to justice." Morland strode up and down the room as he talked, and I thought I had never seen him look more manly. I felt a new respect for him, and a willingness to help him in any way I might. "Of course," Morland went on, "we must not make definite arrangements without consulting Mrs. Van Wyck. It is for her to say whether we shall engage a detective." He flashed a defiant glance at Mrs. Carstairs as he spoke, but it did not ruffle the calm of that self-reliant personage. Barbara went away to confer with Anne on the subject, and soon returned saying that her stepmother expressed entire indifference in the matter. She was perfectly willing that the detective should be engaged, if Barbara and Morland wished it. "Do you know of a good detective, Mr. Mellon?" I asked, while my thoughts flew to Fleming Stone and his marvellous ability. But that great detective was far away, and so unavailable. "I know of none in Crescent Falls village," returned the coroner, "but I can send for a very good man from the city. His name is Markham, and I have reason to know he is exceedingly clever and successful, and though not a low-priced man, his fees are not exorbitant." "Thank you, Mr. Mellon," said Barbara simply. "That is the kind of man I should like to investigate this case. I am sure I am correct in my beliefs, and I think a detective can find the pearls for us. There is no other crime to be discovered." "That is what I think." And moved by a sympathy of opinions, Mrs. Carstairs glided up to Barbara and took her hands. But she found herself coldly repulsed as Miss Van Wyck said curtly, "Do you?" And drawing her hands from the clasp of the housekeeper, she moved slowly toward the door, with a backward glance at the still figure of her father. And then came the undertaker and his men, and the coroner dismissed all of us, except Dr. Mason. As we all walked silently through the corridor, Morland and Barbara turned aside into Anne's room. I asked them to assure Mrs. Van Wyck of my sympathy, and to tell her how glad I would be if I might do anything for her. The message sounded perfunctory, but I think I had never said sincerer words. The rest of us went various ways, Archer going off to his own room, and Mrs. Carstairs toward the servants' wing. I went to the library, and after a short time, Morland joined me there. "How is Mrs. Van Wyck?" I inquired. "She's composed," he answered briefly, "but exhausted from the shock. She is entirely unable to discuss details of arrangements, and says for Barbara and myself to manage things as we choose. She sends thanks for your kind message, and hopes to see you later in the day." My heart gave a throb at this, for though I was longing to see Anne, I wanted the suggestion to come from her. "Then of course you will take complete authority," I said to Morland, who sat on the edge of a table, moodily swinging one foot back and forth. "Yes," he said angrily, "if I can circumvent that Carstairs woman." I had resolved to be very discreet on this subject, so I only said, "She is a strange personality." "She's a serpent," Morland muttered, and just then Mrs. Stelton and Miss Fordyce appeared at the doorway. "Mayn't we come in?" begged Mrs. Stelton in her pouting, childish way. "We're so frightened and lonesome." Beth Fordyce said nothing, but her big blue eyes were full of tears as she looked at Morland. "Certainly," I said, rising. "Please come in and talk to me." The latter's speech seemed necessary, for at their entrance Morland walked out of the room without a word. "Poor Mr. Morland," said Mrs. Stelton, wringing her little hands fussily. "I am so sorry for him. I wish I could comfort him." "I think he likes best to be let alone," I said. "Aside from his natural sorrow, he is suddenly loaded with grave responsibilities enough to overwhelm any man." "They will not overwhelm him." It was Miss Fordyce who spoke, and her eyes had the far-away look that always showed in them when her mood was occult. "I shall care for his spirit and sustain him in his hour. "Now, Beth, let up on that rubbish," and Mrs. Stelton was so in earnest that she forgot to flutter. "You tell Mr. Sturgis what you have to tell him." "I've nothing to tell," and Miss Fordyce looked positively dreamy. "Yes, you have," and Mrs. Stelton took her arm and shook her slightly. "Wake up now, and stop your nonsense. Tell Mr. Sturgis what you saw last night." "Was it a vision?" I asked, resigning myself to one of her usual psychic experiences. "I did have a vision," the girl began, but Mrs. Stelton interrupted her again. "Never mind your vision. Stick to plain facts. You tell Mr. Sturgis the story, just exactly as you told it to me." "What is it?" I asked, interested now and hoping it might be something of real importance. "Please tell me at once, Miss Fordyce, for someone may come in here at any moment." As she frequently did, Miss Fordyce changed her manner suddenly, and spoke with alert energy. "It's only this. I was awake last night, and I rose and sat by my window for a long time. The moon was bright, and everything looked so beautiful it did my soul good. Well, as I sat there—" "Excuse me a moment, Miss Fordyce. Which is your room?" "Directly over this," she replied. "On the second floor." "I have the front room on the other side of the second floor," I said, realizing that she could not see the east wing from her window. "Yes, I know," said Mrs. Stelton. "You have the room directly over Anne's. Mr. Archer's room is over Mr. Van Wyck's bedroom. Mr. Van Wyck used to have the room Mr. Archer has now, before he married Anne. Then he had the first floor suite done up, and positively the rooms are of regal splendor. Why, Anne's dressing room—" "Go on with your story, please, Miss Fordyce," I said, taking advantage of one of Mrs. Stelton's pauses for breath. "As I sat by my window," the girl went on, "I saw a very large motor car come slowly along the main road. It halted now and then, not as if because of any mechanical trouble, but as if its driver hesitated about proceeding. After stopping 2 or 3 times, it finally came into the grounds and up our main road. But it continued to pause now and then, until at last it made a mad dash round the house, passing right under my window. I didn't see the car again, but a few moments later, I saw some person wrapped in a large coat walk stealthily by my window. I don't know whether it was a man or a woman, but whoever it was seemed afraid of being seen. For the dark figure hid twice behind trees, and then suddenly ran swiftly away in the same direction the motor car had gone." "At what time did all this happen?" I asked. "I'm not sure, but it was not far from midnight. At any rate, between 12 and 1. "Miss Fordyce," I said, "as you know, a great mystery at present surrounds the death of Mr. Van Wyck. This incident you saw may have a bearing on the matter, and it may not. But won't you promise me not to speak of it to anyone else? And at the coroner's inquest, which will be held this afternoon, won't you tell this story simply and straightforwardly, as you have told it to me?" "At the inquest!" Miss Fordyce exclaimed. "Oh, I just couldn't." "Yes, you can," I answered her sternly, "and you must. If you do it rightly you may be of great help to the whole Van Wyck family; while if you are foolish about it, you may impede justice and cause untold trouble." "There, I told you so!" cried Mrs. Stelton. "I knew it was important. Now, Beth, you come along with me. I'll see to it, Mr. Sturgis, that this girl tells her story, and tells it right, when she is called upon to do so." "Thank you, Mrs. Stelton," I said heartily, and I had never liked the little lady so well before. "Keep Miss Fordyce up to the mark, and don't let her slip away into her dreams and visions." The two went away together, and I started off for a stroll by myself, to see what a little fresh air would do towards straightening out the complex questions that were baffling my brain. 8. Enter a detective. I walked along the paths, my eyes cast down and my hands behind me, while I brooded over the situation. I had the grace to be utterly ashamed of the fact that beneath all other considerations, I was conscious of a realization that Anne was now free. I would not allow myself to put this thought into words. I tried to evade and ignore it; but it brought a peace to my soul that shone steadily through all the disturbing problems that filled my consciousness. First was the great problem of Van Wyck's death. Was it suicide or murder? And then I thought how futile even to wonder about that until the inquest, when unexpected disclosures might immediately solve the mystery. Next was the problem of what Anne would do. But that, it seemed to me, was an indelicacy even to think about at present. So I resolutely put it away from me and turned my thoughts to the story Beth Fordyce had told. It was certainly strange that a motor should come into the Van Wyck estate at midnight, and that it should alternately halt and proceed in such a mysterious manner. Also that its entrance and disappearance should be followed by the presence of a stealthy cloaked figure. But again, was Beth Fordyce's word reliable? I had no doubt of her integrity, but the girl had such strange fancies and such a vivid imagination that I could not place implicit reliance on the story as she had told it. To her distorted mental vision, a belated pedestrian might assume the mystery of a prowling marauder. And yet, she had said the figure passed under her window, which would of course mean someone intending either rightly or wrongfully to enter the house. And, too, the strange proceedings of the motor car, though perhaps exaggerated by her, could scarcely be all imagination, unless the girl had wilfully made up this story, which I did not believe. But again, if the occupant of the motor car had indeed been a criminal, a thief and a murderer, with fell intent against David Van Wyck, how had he entered the study, committed his crimes, and departed again, leaving every outlet of the room securely fastened on the inside? This question proved unanswerable, so I gave it up and began to retrace my steps toward the house. As I neared the stables, I noticed a man coming along the same road that I had seen Mrs. Carstairs slowly following early that same morning. I paused a moment to watch him, and I saw that it was Carstairs, the valet. To my surprise, he repeated exactly the procedure of his mother. He stepped along slowly, carefully examining the ground, and had every appearance of a man searching for some small lost article. He had a stick in his hand, and he even scraped the dirt of the road now and then, peering closely, as if in a desperate search. I determined to come upon him suddenly, as I had surprised his mother, and see if he were as apt at explaining himself as she had been. I approached very quietly, and as I was just at his elbow, I said, "What have you lost?" The man dropped his stick and raised a white startled face. Nothing, sir. I assure you, I have lost nothing." "What are you looking for, then? I will help you find it." I picked up the stick he had dropped and began poking in the dust myself. But he said, stammering, and with a pleading expression, No, I have not lost anything, sir. Give me back my stick, I beg of you." "Look here, Carstairs, it's no crime to lose anything, but to be so secret about it and so rattled betokens a guilty conscience of some sort." "Yes, sir. Very good, sir. I'm not rattled, sir. And indeed, sir, I have not lost anything." Clearly the man had not his mother's faculty for rising to a situation. Without a doubt they had both been searching for the same thing, as I saw them both closely examining the ground in the same place. But she had tossed off my questions with witty repartee, while he was the embodiment of agonized embarrassment. I went on toward the house with a new problem added to my brain collection: the problem of the two searchers, who both denied having lost anything, and who were mother and son. Collusion and secrecy were certainly shown here. I had no clue to the solution of this mystery, and thought that very likely it was a matter of no importance anyway. When I reached the house, Barbara met me with the welcome news that Anne desired to see me. I was conducted to her dressing room, and as I entered, I realized the truth of what I had been told regarding the Van Wycks' apartments. A more exquisite gem of a room I never saw. It was furnished entirely in Louis XVI effects, and was a miracle of gilded carving and rose-colored brocade. "And you call this a dressing room?" I said, endeavoring to be casual. "I think boudoir a more appropriate term." Anne smiled. "I hate a French word," she said, "when English will do as well. And I especially dislike the term sitting room, so what could I do? And it is my dressing room, as you see." She waved her hand toward a daintily appointed toilette table, glittering with glass and gold. I scarcely knew whether to continue the conversation on trivial matters, or whether to speak of the tragedy. Anne herself was perfectly composed, though pale and with an air of forcing herself to be quiet and natural. But after a few moments of beating time, I said, "Let's not evade the subject that fills both our minds. May we not speak of it?" "How nice you are!" said Anne, and her eyes beamed with gratitude. "You always do the right thing, Raymond. My heart is bursting to talk of these things, yet everyone thinks I don't want to." "Talk to me," I said gently. "Just as you will. Say anything that is in your heart." I was on dangerous ground, and I knew it, but I held myself well in hand. Anne looked lovelier than ever in a white lacy sort of boudoir gown and a lace cap on her beautiful hair. Also, she looked pathetic, and as if greatly in need of some one to lean on for sympathy and counsel. "Let us talk it over freely," I said. "You cannot be brave and courageous, Anne, as you must be, if you are afraid to face the facts. You don't think your husband took his own life, do you?" "I'm sure he did not. David had no reason for such an act. He was a man fond of life; and beside he had this project of the library in mind, and he was more than anxious to carry it through. There is no reason, there can be no reason, why he should kill himself. But Raymond," and her white brows drew tensely, "how could any one kill him and get away afterward, leaving the study locked? I've thought over that until I'm nearly crazy. You see, I know how perfectly impossible it is to get into the room when the door is locked. Because—" "Because what?" I gently prompted her. A look of pain came into her eyes, followed by a sudden determination, and she went on. "I may as well tell you. Because my husband and I have had some fearful quarrels. Invariably he would go and shut himself in the study afterward. I knew it was my duty to try to make peace with him, and often I have tried to get into the study in spite of him. I have even tried to get in at a window, while he would sit inside and smile at me in mockery." "What you have been through with that man!" I exclaimed. "Yes. And yet he was often very good to me. At times he was a perfect brute, but it was because of his really ungovernable temper. Then again he would fairly spoil me with kindness. But of late his kindness had become more and more rare, and he was sarcastic and cruel much of the time. I tell you this, Raymond, because I want you to understand that while I respected and admired David in many ways, I cannot mourn him as I would mourn a man I loved." This admission brought joy to my own heart, but I knew this was no time or place to let it be known, and as a matter of precaution I hurriedly changed the subject. "What a strange woman Mrs. Carstairs is!" I said. "Had she an especial interest in Mr. Van Wyck?" "Oh, she adored him," and Anne spoke carelessly, as if it were a matter of no moment to her. "At one time she hoped to marry him, but David had no such intention. So of course she resented my presence here, and has never been nice to me. It didn't bother me much, though she is annoying. I tried to have her dismissed, but Carstairs is such a perfect valet, David would not give him up, so they both remained. Now they can both go." Anne spoke with a sudden vindictiveness, and just at that moment Mrs. Carstairs appeared in the open doorway. Her arrival was so opportune that I felt positive she had been listening outside the door. She did not seem angry, but there was a feline note in her voice as she said, "You are speaking of me, Mrs. Van Wyck?" It is a tribute to Anne's wonderful poise that she was in no way ruffled. She spoke quietly as she replied, "Yes, Mrs. Carstairs, since you chanced to overhear, I am quite willing to repeat what I said. As there is no longer any occasion for your son's services, you will doubtless prefer to go away with him. But I beg you will consult your own pleasure as to the time of your departure, and not feel obliged to make inconvenient haste." It was a clash of superior forces. If Anne showed self-control, the housekeeper was even more absolutely at ease. "Thank you, Mrs. Van Wyck," she returned in silvery tones. "I shall take advantage of your kind permission, and remain here, at least until we have discovered the solution of the mystery that surrounds the death of Mr. Van Wyck. It may be that I can be of assistance to you." "I scarcely think that," and Anne's slight smile would have rasped a saint. "But you are at liberty to stay as long as you choose." The latter part of the speech was almost patronizing, and distinctly in the manner of a mistress to a servant, and it scored. Mrs. Carstairs' eyes flashed, and she winced as if flicked with a whip. But in an instant she had dropped her eyelids, and though she merely said, "Thank you," and left the room, her air was so unvanquished, even victorious, that she really had the final word. "You see," said Anne, spreading her hands deprecatingly, "one cannot contend with that sort of thing, except between equals." "I appreciate that perfectly," I returned very seriously, "but you must realize, Anne, that she is a dangerous woman. You are no match for her, because though you have marvelous perceptions and mental powers, yet you are innocent and right minded. That woman is all wrong. I don't know in what respects. I don't know anything about her. But she is capable of crime." To my consternation, Anne turned white to the very lips. She put her hands before her eyes as if to shut out some dreadful sight, and she moaned in a whisper, "Oh, Raymond, I am capable of crime, too." "There, there," I said, soothingly. "That woman has wrought on your nerves. For that matter, child, everybody is capable of crime. I had no business to say what I did. I'm a churl, a mischief maker." Anne lifted her eyes and almost smiled at my self abasement, and then, as her maid entered the room, she said, "What is it, Jeanette?" "Mr. Archer, madame. He wishes to see you." "Tell him to come in," said Anne graciously, and then herself added, "Come on in, Connie. There's no one here but Mr. Sturgis." Archer came in, looking preoccupied. With scant ceremony he threw himself into a chair, and said abruptly, "Now look here, Anne, how about this detective? Do you want him to come?" "No," said Anne simply. "I thought so. Now Mellon has sent for him, and unless we telephone contrary orders or something, he'll be here to day." "Why don't you want him, Anne?" I asked in astonishment. "I think it is necessary to have him. The mystery must be cleared up, and, too, the missing pearls must be found. Surely a detective could help." "Well, then, let him come." Anne spoke almost pettishly, and I suddenly realized that her composure was forced, and her self control was beginning to give way. "I think," said Archer to me, "that Mrs. Van Wyck's wishes should be law in this matter." "Of course," I agreed. "But perhaps Mrs. Van Wyck doesn't realize how customary it is, and how necessary it is to employ a detective in such a case as this." "I needn't see him, need I?" asked Anne, raising imploring eyes to mine. "No," I began, when Archer interrupted. "Of course you'll have to see him, and he'll ask you all sorts of questions, and tangle you up so that you won't know what you're saying." As usual, Anne did the unexpected. She suddenly assumed a dignified, even haughty air, and said, "Let him come. Let him question me as much as he likes. I'm not afraid of such questioning. When will he arrive?" "I don't know," said Archer. "Probably this afternoon, or perhaps before luncheon. I'm glad you're getting your nerve back, Anne, for the inquest will be held this afternoon, and you will have to testify. Now don't let yourself get rattled." "I shall not get rattled," Anne said slowly. "But, Connie, I don't want to testify, or whatever you call it. Why should I? I don't know who killed David, or anything about it." "But you will be called on," said Archer, "and you must keep your head. Don't break down or anything. Answer the questions directly and shortly, and you'll soon be let off." This was good, sound advice, and I was glad Archer gave it to her. I wished she would look to me more for counsel or help, but she seemed to depend on Archer as an old friend. Indeed, after a time, she said, "Run away now, will you, Raymond? I have some things I want to talk over with Connie alone." This summary dismissal nearly took my breath away, but I rose and went off nonchalantly, hiding my chagrin as best I could. Immediately after luncheon the detective came. Mr. Markham was a commonplace looking man, of a manner somewhat self assured. He was perhaps even a trifle conceited, but he seemed to have common sense and a good grasp of the logical. He was quick and alert of manner, and went about his work in a systematic and methodical way. The household was divided as to the necessity for his presence. Morland and Barbara seemed to want him, but Anne and Archer refused to see him unless absolutely necessary. For some reason Barclay Lassiter appeared deeply incensed at his presence. Indeed, the secretary abruptly took his hat and went home when Mr. Markham arrived, saying he would return for the inquest. For myself, I listened eagerly to the detective's opinions. Of course he was allowed immediate access to the study, and of course he made a careful examination of the whole room. But he found nothing that would throw any light on the mystery, and I felt a little disappointed at his non-committal attitude. He spent much time examining locks and bolts and inquiring as to keys. But he only proved what we had known before, that the study was absolutely inaccessible to an intruder. Then, of course, he declared it must have been a suicide. Then, when he was convinced of the utter absence of any weapon, and the practical impossibility of the wound being self-inflicted, he returned to the theory of murder. He was greatly enthused over the mystery of the case and the contradictory evidence. "If I may say so," he observed pompously, "I have been especially fortunate and successful in the criminal cases which I have undertaken. I have the instinct of a sleuth, and I discover clues where none seems to exist. But I never before have had the kind of a case that depends upon proving the presence of an intruder in a locked room. Now, we know that no one could have entered this room and left it locked as it was; and yet, if not a case of suicide, some one did do so. It is for me to discover how." Mr. Markham made this speech with such an air of having made a discovery, that I was not surprised when Morland said brusquely, "We knew already, Mr. Markham, that my father's death was either a suicide or a murder. We knew, too, that this room was so securely barred and bolted that we had to force an entrance. Now we have sent for you to learn if possible the truth of the matter. But what we want is not the propounding of the problem, but its solution." Mr. Markham did not appear at all offended by this, and only said, quite so, Mr. Van Wyck. Now I must remind you that aside from the crime of murder we have the loss of the pearls to consider. I must not only solve the mystery of your father's death, but I must recover those valuable gems." "Very well. I am not, of course, able to do these things in a moment, but by careful investigation and some shrewd deduction I hope to succeed, in time." "Of course, Mr. Markham," said Morland, "I didn't expect results at once. Pursue your own methods, and call on any of us for such information or help as you may desire. Pray consider the house at your disposal, interview the servants if you choose, and feel at liberty to do what you will, unquestioned." "I shall also," returned the detective, "expect to be allowed to interview members of the family or guests." "That, of course," said Morland, "but I must ask of you to spare the feelings of the family as far as you possibly can, and to intrude upon the guests as little as may be." I was not surprised at this from Morland, for it seemed to me that the detective was of a nature so zealous and so unheedful of others' feelings that he might easily prove an annoying interviewer. Chapters 7 and 8